when we are young, we need physical support as well as psychological support, because without that we wouldn't know how to exist. We need the physical support for us to be able to walk and turn up into a completely full physically fit human being, and then we require the psychological support when we are young so that we are able to make sense of the world around us, because when we are young, all our world is defined by someone who is around us, and we rely on them psychologically for our safety. We rely on them for physical support, and we rely on them for the psychological support. And then up to a certain point, we do let go of the physical support as we grow up, and then we have to earn our own living, which makes us physically independent. But do we ever let go of the psychological support or the habit of seeking psychological support? The psychological support might not be uh, necessarily from the ones that we were seeking support when we were young. We can seek the psychological support from some other source, but the tendency to seek support remain as it is. Somewhere we are unable to grow out of that sense, that requirement, that need of psychological support. So we have to ask ourselves, is it necessary for us to have this perpetual psychological support in our life? If we are completely physically independent, shouldn't we be psychologically independent also? The one who is unable to make their own living, the one who is unable to support themselves physically, we tend to traditionally look down upon them. But if someone is seeking psychological support or continue to seek that psychological support, we think that that is natural, that that is something that everyone wants. If we are physically fit and if we are able to take care of ourselves, make our own living, then we don't require any sort of physical or financial support. But when it comes to the psychological support, we tend to think of it as a necessity. It is something that all of us need at every point in time, and knowingly and unknowingly we have so many innumerable psychological support that our whole inward self is resting upon these supports. And whenever one of the many support that we have somehow shakes or is taken away from us, that is when our misery begins. That is where our suffering begins. That is when we feel the sorrow of separation. That is when we understand the perils of attachment, because psychologically there are a host of things upon which we rely. Firstly, there are our relationships that we have in our life, our near and dear ones, and then there are our own habits, our likes, our wants, and then there are certain patterns in our daily routines that we are used to, and so on and so on. There are many inward things that we rely on psychologically. We wouldn't even know the amount or the types or the different ways where we seek psychological support. And one when there is a possibility of either one of these support collapsing or not being there anymore, we fear, we are scared, we would do anything to make sure that that psychological support stay as is, stay the where, stay at the place where it needs to be, and we'll do anything to make sure that it isn't taken away from us. And then we may begin to indulge ourselves in all kinds of illusions, deceits and lies. There would be no end to the extent that we are willing to go to not let go of this psychological support that we so heavily depend on. Our whole entire existence is based on these innumerable supports that we have inwardly, that we rely on. Our whole psyche is dependent upon these supports, and to function adequately we need them to stay as they are, to not be ripped apart from us. In a sense, we use these supports to stand on, and the absence of these supports, in a case where we think that they will be taken away from us, we begin to feel insecure. Our whole security relies on these number of psychological support that we have collected inwardly, and without these supports we won't be able to stand by our own self. We will be inwardly so insecure that having to let go of any of these support will frighten us, would challenge our very existence. We may even become violent, aggressive when there is a threat to any of the support. Our whole psyche, our whole inward structure is nothing but these supports, but these innumerable ways in our daily life, these innumerable relationships that we rely on to hold ourselves together. And this is the beginning of sorrow. This is how suffering begins, because we have so closely associated ourselves with these supports that we think we are them, and the cessation of any of these support is the cessation of us. If they cease to exist, so will I. We are so closely identified with these dependencies that we have given birth to in our lives that their absence begins to feel like our own absence, like we are not there. We say that in common language, we would say that, you know, this thing is so dear to me that they are a part of me. And so superficially, it may look like the person is so in love with that thing, with that act, or with somebody else, that they consider them it as their part. But this equation, if we look at it closely, is one of violence, because the very existence of their being now relies on this part that they think as something of their own, and that is not the case. It is this dependency, this sheer deep reliance that they have created on this thing, that their whole existence depend on it. And so the absence of that thing actually threatens their existence, threatens their very being. And if that thing with which they are so supposedly in love with, if that cease to exist, they will cease to exist too. And so this is the perils, the problem with having these innumerable psychological support, that within us it makes us incomplete, it makes us dependent, that within us we are fragmented, that we need a support, that we are unable to stand by our own self. These psychological supports that all of us have in our life may look as a very normal thing, a very usual kind of support that everyone should have in their lives. But this whole equation of depending, of having these psychological dependencies, are the result of our own inability to be completely psychologically independent, to be inwardly free. When we declare our psychological supports in our relationships, in our activities, in our routines, what we are really declaring is that we are in a deep slavery, that we are in foundations, that we in ourselves are inadequate, that we in ourselves are incomplete, that we are inwardly not free, that we are enslaved. And being enslaved, what we rely on is then these outward supports, which have such an important place in our lives, which hold such an important position in our life. The more valuable a support becomes, the more valuable a routine, a pattern, a form of entertainment becomes for us, the more we curb our ability to stand on our own feet, to be completely free, the more we restrict our own freedom, the whole inward structure is nothing but a repository of these psychological supports that we have gathered throughout our lives. And that is why death is so painful to us, because it snatches away the very pillar of our inward structure that we relied on. That is why death becomes so insufferable, because it is in a relationship, it is in a person that we founded our own being. There was nothing within us where we would lay the foundation of our existence, and so the foundation of our existence relied on a particular person in a particular relationship. And when that ends, what is really ending is that inward support that we relied on. We are not in sorrow of the person passing by, but what we are in real sorrow of is losing that inward psychological support that we could rely on. Because death takes that away, we fear it, we fear ending, we fear cessation, we fear things coming to an end, precisely because we have made them a part of our existence. The thing, the relationship, the person is now included in the vast network of the psychological support that our whole life is. Our life is nothing but this intricate network of innumerable psychological support that we stand on. And whenever one of the support is taken down from under our own feet, we feel unstable, we feel incomplete, we fear the risk of falling. And it is that fear which makes us suffer, which makes us sorrowful. To be, to exist, is to understand how we rely so heavily on the psychological support, how these outward things, relationships, routines, our own habits, etc., become the very center of our existence. We may think that they are just a different part of our life, but it is only these parts that make up our existence, and losing any of these parts is equivalent to losing ourselves, because inwardly there is nothing within which has understood, which has any depth, which relies on itself, which inwardly has found a ground which doesn't require any support, and it is that ground where we lay our foundation of existence. And when that ground is missing, when we haven't worked, when we haven't laid our foundation on that ground, what we have really are these myriad psychological supports that we rely on. And so to be completely free is to understand how we gather throughout our lives these multiple supports and begin to live off them. They are not just a part of our life, but the very basis of our existence. And to make something else, something outside of us, the basis of our existence, is to invite suffering and misery for ourselves. Having these psychological supports in our life begs the question of the quality of relationship that we would have with the supports that we relate to. Wouldn't the thing that we support, that we rely on, the relationship that we depend on, be of just a simple usage to us of serving a purpose for our own existence? And when we depend in our relationships, when there is reliance, dependence in our relationships, the quality of those relationships are nothing but one of mutual use, that we would consent to the use of one another, and that will be the underlying principle of every relationship that we would have, because we use that relationship, that habit, as a support for ourselves. It is not really the relationship that we are concerned about, but what we are actually concerned about is our own self, how that relationship would serve us. And because what we are interested is our own service, is our own self, we would find that the relationships that we have in our life are just of mutual use. There is no real relating with one another. What is just that you support me and I support you, and the one who already is relying on the other for their psychological support, how can they provide any sort of actual real love and health in that relationship, when the basis of a relationship is formed upon dependencies, is formed upon an equation that I need you, and so you become the support for me and I would become the support for you. Both ways there would be a conflict of the inability to support the other completely. Because by definition, the psychological support that we are inviting in our life has to serve the purpose of supporting us psychologically. And when that is missing, we will find that there is conflict, we will find that there is suffering in that relationship. And so as long as there is a purpose involved, as long as we are looking to fulfill a certain need within us, the relationship that we form is one of abuse and exploitation. In such a relationship, the use of the other is inevitable, and where there is use, the abuse is right around the corner. Having a psychological support in a form of relationship breeds insecurity, because we would be fearful of losing that support, and so we would be in a state of perpetual insecurity. There would be nothing within us that would be free of fear, that would be free of jealousy, of possession. Our supports would become our possession, and losing our possession would make us insecure. All our relationships would end up becoming merely a possession for us, something to have, something to acquire, something to depend on. That will become the foundation of our relationship. This inward dependency, this inward inadequacy that we seek to fulfill through our relationship. Until we see and are aware of how our whole existence depends upon this structure, this network of different psychological supports that we have gathered in our life, we will never be free of insecurity, of suffering, of sorrow. Pain is right around the corner. Always. Insecurity would be alive and thriving within us if all our existence is this network of psychological support that we possess. We may call ourselves an individual, we may identify ourselves with a face, with a name, but there would be nothing that would be really qualified within us to be termed as an individual, as someone who is indivisible, as someone who really is, because what we are these supports, and without this structure of different psychological supports, we find that we are nothing, and so we cling to this support, to this network, and it is this clinging, this holding on, this grabbing to our own possessions is the story, the essence of our life. We are never really free inwardly. We will always depend upon our identities, our relationships, our needs, our likes, our wants, and that is what we will come to identify as our life. This is a disability that we would be living with all our life, when in the name of living all we do is depend, cling, hold on, then we are inherently, psychologically, a disabled individual. Who only has suffering and insecurity to look forward to. And the pain of death. Seeing how we rely on this support, seeing how our whole existence is founded upon this network of psychological support, transforms this state of dependency within. Seeing our own reliance on this psychological network, we can free ourselves from this deep dependency that we have cultivated within us. And it is only then we are alive, only then we are living. It is only then we would be able to have relationships that do not use, that do not exploit, that are free of dependencies. And that is when we would truly, for the first time in our lives, will relate with the other, without turning the other as a support, as something to rely on. If we are free physically, economically, then it is our responsibility to be free psychologically also, to not have inward dependencies, to not base our existence on our relationships, on our habits, on the daily intricacies of our lives. The very nature of the ego is to associate itself with someone, with an act, with a thing, with a person. And this association forms and then becomes our support, our dependency. So we have to understand the ways of the self, how it only comes alive when it is able to associate itself with a thing, with a person. And the stronger these associations, the heavier our reliance, the deeper our dependency on that thing, on that person, and the further we push ourselves into bondages, the further we curb our own freedom to learn, to observe the ways of the ego is to keep oneself free and independent of any psychological support. And it is only then that one is truly secure, that one is really living